Master Chief Marcus Thorne, late of the United States Navy SEALs, had run out of road. Divorced, estranged from the daughter who no longer recognized him, and living out of a Ford F-150 with more rust than paint, he'd driven north until the continent gave way to the cold, gray waters of the Puget Sound. He bought a grounded, Cold War-era submarine rusting in the mud for his last $50, expecting only a steel shell to keep the winter rain off his head. But on the third day, his scarred war dog, Ghost, a Belgian Malinois who dragged him from the rubble of Ramadi, froze over a welded plate in the sub's belly. He would not move. Behind that plate waited a secret sealed for 20 years, a dead man's war, and a reason to live again. Comment a number from 1 to 10 and tell us where you are watching from tonight. The road had ended here, in a forgotten corner of Washington, where the pines grew thick and the fog rolled in off the water like a shroud. For Marcus Thorne, it was the logical conclusion to a long, slow retreat from the world. The man he was, the Master Chief who could lead a team through the labyrinthine hell of a contested city, who could hold his breath for 3 minutes and his nerve for an eternity, had died somewhere in the dust of Iraq. The man who survived was a collection of scars, a limp that bit harder when the cold set in, and a memory that played on a loop. Ramadi, 2006, the crump of the IED, the sudden violent lurch of the world, and then darkness. He remembered the taste of concrete dust and copper, the smell of burnt wiring and diesel fuel. He remembered the immense, crushing weight of a collapsed roof pinning his leg, the shouts of his men fading into a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He was ready to let go. Then, a scratching sound, a frantic whining, and a wet nose pushing insistently at his face. It was Ghost, then a young military working dog, digging through the debris, refusing to leave him. Ghost had found him, had stayed with him, had dragged him by his vest toward a sliver of light until the rescue teams arrived. The dog had saved his life, and in the years that followed, had saved his sanity more times than he could count. His wife, Elena, had tried to understand. She had held him through the night sweats, had listened to him name the dead in his sleep. But the man she had married was gone, replaced by a tense, watchful stranger who scanned every room for exits and flinched at the sound of a car backfiring. She left, not with anger, but with a quiet, exhausted sorrow. His daughter, Sarah, who was just a child when he deployed, grew up seeing a ghost at her dinner table. Now a young woman herself, she saw only a broken man who couldn't hold a job, who couldn't stay in one place, who was lost in a war she would never understand. His last call to her, a month ago, had been a disaster of stilted apologies and long, painful silences. He'd sold his tools, his watch, everything of value until all that was left was the truck, the dog, and a duffel bag with a spare set of fatigues. The Navy had given him medals and a pension, but the world had no place for a man whose only remaining skill was a quiet, lethal competence. So he drove north, chasing the silence. The scrapyard was at the end of a dirt road, a graveyard of marine hardware bleeding rust into the tidal flats. And there, half sunk in the muck, was the submarine. It wasn't a warship. It was a deep submergence research vehicle, a relic of the Cold War named the Stingray. It was a place to stop running, a place to disappear. The cold was coming, and a steel hull was better than the cab of a truck. Ghost sat beside him in the passenger seat, his graying muzzle resting on the door, his intelligent eyes fixed on the rusted behemoth. The dog whined softly, a low thrum of uncertainty. Marcus reached over and scratched behind his scarred ear. "It's okay, boy," he murmured, the words feeling hollow even to him. It's just a place to rest. The owner of the scrapyard was a man named Silas, whose face was a road map of wrinkles carved by sun and salt. A faded Seabees tattoo was visible on his forearm, a testament to a different war in a different jungle. He watched Marcus pull up, his eyes taking in the beat-up truck, the military bearing that no amount of weariness could erase, and the disciplined Malinois that sat silently in the passenger seat. He didn't ask questions. He knew the look of a man carrying a heavy load. Marcus got out, the damp air making the old injury in his leg ache. "The submarine," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Is it for sale?" Silas grunted, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "The Stingray? She's been rotting in that mud for 30 years. Costs more to haul her out for scrap than she's worth." "What do you want with a steel coffin?" Marcus looked from the sub back to the old man. "A place to stay out of the rain." He pulled the last of his cash from his pocket, a crumpled $50 bill. "It's all I've got." Silas looked at the money, then back at Marcus's face. He saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the deep lines of pain etched around his mouth. He saw the dog, whose gaze never left his man. He'd seen boys like this come home from Vietnam, hollowed out and searching for a quiet place to land. He nodded slowly and took the bill. "She's yours, Chief," he said, the rank falling from his lips with easy familiarity. "Just know what you're buying." He leaned against a pile of rusted anchor chains, his voice lowering. "She's got a history. The last fella who tried to make a home of her, name of Peterson, Navy captain. Vanished. Must be 20 years ago now." Marcus's attention sharpened. Silas continued, his eyes on the horizon. "A week after he went missing, some men showed up. Not cops. Quiet types in dark sedans with government plates. They poked around for a few days, asked questions nobody had answers to, and then they were gone. Never saw them again. Whatever Peterson was into, it wasn't simple." He gave Marcus a hard look. "The tide comes in high here. Don't get yourself trapped. And watch the rust. Some of those deck plates are thin as paper." The real warning, Marcus understood, had nothing to do with tides or rust. He thanked Silas and walked toward his new home. The Stingray was bigger up close, a black whale-like shape listing in the gray mud. Rust wept in long orange streaks down its pitted hull. The conning tower stood like a crooked tombstone. He found the main hatch, and with a grunt of effort, wrenched it open. The air that rose from within was stale, thick with the smell of mildew, cold steel, and decay. He lowered himself down the ladder, Ghost following with a quiet confidence that belied the unfamiliar territory. Inside, it was a skeleton. The control panels were stripped, the wiring pulled, the sensitive equipment long gone, but the pressure hull was intact. It was a dark, cylindrical world of empty racks and bare metal, a steel tube designed to withstand the crushing pressures of the deep ocean. For Marcus, it felt strangely familiar. It was a defensible position, a place to hold. He stood in the gloom, the only light coming from the open hatch above, and felt the weight of the world recede, replaced by the simple physical reality of the cold, silent steel around him. The first few days were a blur of hard, physical labor that quieted the noise in his head. Marcus worked from dawn until the light failed, fueled by coffee brewed on a small camp stove. He sealed the leaking seams with marine epoxy he scavenged from Silas's workshop. He scrubbed the mildew from the bulkheads, the scent of bleach a clean, sharp counterpoint to the years of decay. He ran a wire from a portable generator to a single string of lights, casting a pale, sterile glow through the main compartment. He set up a cot, his old sleeping bag, and a small table. It was Spartan, but it was his. Ghost seemed to settle in, his initial wariness giving way to a quiet acceptance of their new, strange den. He would lie on an old blanket near the cot, watching Marcus work, a silent, steady presence. But on the third day, that changed. Marcus was in the aft section, cleaning out what used to be the battery compartment, a cramped space deep in the belly of the sub. Suddenly, Ghost, who had been dozing, shot to his feet. A low whine escaped his throat. He moved past Marcus, his nose to the deck, sniffing intently. He stopped over a rectangular steel plate, about 3 feet by 4, set flush with the floor. The plate was different from the surrounding diamond plate decking. The steel was a slightly different color, the weld bead around its perimeter too clean, too precise. It lacked the deep pitting and corrosion that marked the rest of the vessel. Ghost lowered his head, his body tensed. A growl started deep in his chest, a sound Marcus hadn't heard since their last tour. The dog pawed at the steel, his claws making a useless scratching sound against the metal. "Easy, boy," Marcus said, his voice calm. "It's probably just a rat's nest under there." He tried to call him off, but Ghost ignored him. The dog was locked on, his focus absolute. He lay down, his body completely covering the plate, and refused to move. The low, menacing growl never ceased. Marcus tried to push him gently. "Come on, Ghost. Leave it." The dog's muscles bunched, and he didn't budge. His amber eyes looked up at Marcus, and in them was an insistence, a certainty that chilled him. This wasn't about a rat. This was the same look Ghost had when he'd found a hidden IED, the same unwavering focus he'd had just before a firefight. The dog knew something was wrong. The hair on Marcus's arms stood up. His own training, buried under layers of exhaustion and despair, began to stir. He knelt beside Ghost, running his hand over the cold steel plate. He looked at the welds again. They were professional, but they were not original Navy work. This was an addition, an alteration. He took a heavy wrench from his toolkit and tapped the center of the plate. The sound was a dull thud. He tapped the deck beside it, and the sound was a solid, dense clank. He moved back to the plate and tapped near the edge. This time the sound was different. A faint, resonant boom. It was hollow. Something was under there, something that had been sealed away. Ghost looked at him, whined once, then laid his head on his paws, his eyes never leaving the plate. The dog would not let it go, and now neither would Marcus. The smell of hot metal and ozone filled the cramped compartment, a scent that yanked Marcus back to the smell of a breached vehicle, of cutting torches trying to free trapped men. He pushed the memory down, focusing on the task. He'd borrowed an angle grinder from Silas, and the tool screamed as it bit into the clean, hard weld. Sparks showered the bulkhead, a brilliant, fleeting orange in the gloom. Ghost lay a few feet away, out of the line of fire, panting lightly from the heat and noise, but never taking his eyes off the plate. He was a silent, vigilant partner in this desecration. It took hours. The work was slow, punishing. The enclosed space amplified the noise to a deafening roar, and the vibrations traveled up his arms, through his shoulders, settling in the bones of his skull. He worked with a methodical patience, cutting one side, then the next, his movements precise and economical. He was no longer a drifter. He was an operator again, focused on a single objective. Finally, the last of the weld gave way with a groan. He switched off the grinder, and the sudden silence was immense, broken only by his own harsh breathing and ghosts soft panting. Using a long crowbar, he found purchase in the groove he'd cut and levered the heavy plate upwards. It resisted, sealed by time and pressure, then lifted with a deep, sucking sound. He slid it aside. Beneath was not the inner hull he expected, but a carefully constructed, watertight void. The air that rose from it was dry, ancient, and inside, stacked with military precision, were more than 24 black Pelican cases. His heart hammered against his ribs. He reached in and lifted one out. It was heavy, solid. He clicked open the latches. The case was lined with foam, and nestled inside were neat stacks of bearer bonds, issued by banks in Switzerland and Panama, dated from the early 1980s. Untraceable. He grabbed another case. This one was heavier. He opened it, and the dim light of his work lamp caught the soft, unmistakable gleam of gold. Small 1-kilo bars, stamped with the seal of a Zurich refinery. He opened a third, a fourth. More gold, more bonds. A quick, conservative estimate told him he was looking at tens of millions of dollars. 80 million, maybe more. It was a fortune that could change everything. But on top of the last stack of cases lay something else. A leather-bound journal, wrapped carefully in oilskin to protect it from moisture. He lifted it out. The leather was worn, the pages thick. He opened the cover. Written in neat, blocky handwriting was a name. Captain Elias Peterson, USN, retired. He turned to the first page, and the dead man began to speak. October 12th, 1998. If you are reading this, I am likely dead, and you have found my burden. My name is Elias Peterson. I was the last commander of this vessel, the DSRV Stingray. In my final years of service with naval intelligence, I was tasked with overseeing the financial logistics for a series of off-the-books operations in Central America, run by a CIA handler known only as Kane. When the program was shut down, Kane decided the slush fund, this gold, these bonds, was his retirement package. He arranged for it to be lost in a transport accident. I couldn't let that happen. I intercepted the shipment and concealed it here, in the one place I knew no one would ever look. I welded this compartment myself. But Kane is not a man who forgives or forgets. He will come looking. I was in the Gulf of Tonkin. I saw what men do for secrets. This is my last watch. If you find this, you are the new watchman. Don't trust anyone from Langley, especially not Kane. Marcus closed the journal, the smell of old paper and ink filling his nostrils. This wasn't a treasure. It was a dead man's grenade, and he was holding it with the pin pulled. He lowered the heavy steel plate back into place, the metal grinding against the deck. It didn't fit perfectly anymore, the cut edges a clear sign of tampering. He covered it with a heavy piece of canvas and a pile of old chains, a crude but necessary camouflage. The discovery had changed the very air inside the submarine. The cold steel no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a tomb waiting for another occupant. Every creak of the hull, every slap of water against the metal, was now a potential threat. His training, dormant for so long, surged to the surface. The exhaustion fell away, replaced by a hypervigilance that was as familiar as his own skin. He was on watch. He spent the rest of the day observing, moving with a quiet purpose. He found a high vantage point in Silas's yard, a precarious perch atop a stack of shipping containers that gave him a clear view of the dirt road leading to the yard and the bluffs beyond. He spent hours there, motionless, scanning the landscape. Just after dawn the next morning, he saw him. A figure on the far bluff, partially concealed by a stand of fir trees. He was dressed in plausible hiking gear, Gore-Tex jacket, backpack, but his posture was all wrong. He wasn't admiring the view. He was glassing the scrapyard with a pair of powerful binoculars. He was systematic, sweeping the area in controlled sectors. Marcus watched him through his own cheap, cracked binoculars. The man was a professional, a spotter. Ghost, lying at his feet, saw him too. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a warning that needed no translation. The man stayed for nearly an hour, a patient, silent sentinel, before melting back into the trees. They knew he was here. Later that afternoon, the probe came. A gleaming black Lincoln Navigator, absurdly out of place among the rust and ruin of the yard, crunched to a halt near Silas's office. A man in a tailored suit and polished shoes got out. He was in his late 50s, with silvering hair, a confident smile, and the kind of cold, assessing eyes that missed nothing. He spent a few minutes talking to Silas, who eventually gestured with his thumb toward the Stingray. The man in the suit walked toward the Submarine, his expensive shoes navigating the muddy ground with practiced care. Marcus met him at the hatch, Ghost standing just inside, a rigid, silent statue of fur and muscle. "Mr. Thorne?" the man said, his voice smooth as silk. "My name is Fletcher. I represent a historical preservation society. We specialize in acquiring unique naval artifacts. I was in the area and heard this vessel had been sold. A fascinating piece of Cold War history. My client is prepared to offer you $10,000 for it, as is. A tidy profit on your $50 investment, I'd say." The offer was too quick, too clean. The story was too neat. It was a test, a way to gauge the man they were dealing with. Ghost didn't move, but the low hum vibrating from his chest was as clear as a shouted warning. Marcus's gaze was flat, his face a mask. "She's not for sale." Fletcher's smile never wavered, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A pity. It's a dangerous place for a man to be living, unstable, full of hazards." The veiled threat hung in the damp air between them. "Perhaps you'll reconsider." He produced a crisp business card. "Call me if you change your mind." He turned and walked back to his navigator without a backward glance. Marcus looked at the card. The name was generic, the company logo bland and corporate. He knew with absolute certainty that if he looked it up, the company wouldn't exist. They weren't just waiting anymore. They were closing in. That night, under the dim glow of a single bulb, Marcus read Captain Peterson's journal from cover to cover. The captain's entries were sparse but precise, the log of a man who knew he was being hunted. He detailed Kane's network, a web of influence and corruption that reached from D.C. into local law enforcement. He mentioned a man he trusted, the town's former librarian, whose daughter, Eleanor Vance, had taken over his post. Her father, a good man who served on the Forrestal with me, knew something was wrong, Peterson wrote. He told me to trust her if the worst happened. He also named the local sheriff, a man named Brody, as someone to be wary of. Brody was always too friendly with the men from out of town, the entry read. Too many questions, too eager to please. The last entry was dated the day before he vanished. It was short, almost a scribble. Kane is here. I feel him closing in. If they get me, the real proof is not with the gold. It's where the salt meets the sea. Pier 7, the third piling. The next morning, Marcus left Ghost on guard in the sub and walked the 2 miles into the small coastal town. The library was a quiet, modest brick building. He found Eleanor Vance at the main desk. She was a woman in her late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind her reading glasses. When he quietly mentioned Captain Peterson's name, her professional smile faded, replaced by a look of guarded sorrow. "I haven't heard that name in 20 years," she said softly. She led him to a small, dusty archive room in the back. "My father always said Captain Peterson was one of the most honorable men he ever knew. He said he got tangled in something dirty after he retired, something that got him killed." She listened without interruption as Marcus explained, in clipped, careful sentences, what he had found. Her expression grew grim. She turned to a microfiche machine and began pulling up old property records. Within an hour, she had uncovered it. A shell corporation, registered in Delaware, had purchased 3 key parcels of land surrounding the scrapyard in the weeks following Peterson's disappearance. With a few more clicks, she traced the corporation back to a D.C. holding company, which listed as its primary director a man named Alistair Kane. "He's a big shot now," she murmured, pointing to a news article on her screen. "A private security consultant. Whispers in the ear of senators." The threat was no longer a ghost. It had a name and a face. The net tightened that very night. Marcus was woken from a light, restless sleep by a low growl from Ghost. He was instantly awake, his senses on high alert. He heard it then, the faint crunch of gravel outside, the sound of a vehicle moving slowly without headlights. He moved to the small periscope he had managed to clean and repair. Through the distorted lens, he saw a dark sedan idle at the edge of the yard. A pair of headlights flashed on, sweeping across the Stingray, pinning it in their glare for a long, deliberate minute before switching off. The car then backed away and disappeared into the night. It was a message. The following day, Sheriff Brody paid him a visit. He was a big man with a folksy smile that didn't match his hard, watchful eyes. He leaned against his patrol car, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Heard we got a new resident," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "Just wanted to remind you about the county's vagrancy laws. Living in a piece of scrap metal, well, it can attract the wrong kind of attention. We like to keep things quiet and orderly here." It was a textbook piece of intimidation. They were building a narrative. A troubled, homeless veteran, unstable, unreliable. When something happened to him, no one would ask any hard questions. The trap was being set. They came after midnight, when the tide was out and the moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. Marcus wasn't in the submarine. He and Ghost were already gone, concealed in the deep shadows of a mountain of rusted shipping containers. His instincts, honed over 2 decades of war, had been screaming at him all day. The visit from Brody, the car in the night, it was a classic pattern of escalation. They would not try to talk to him again. Ghost lay beside him, utterly still. The only sign of his tension, a faint tremor running through his powerful body. 2 figures, clad in black, moved through the scrapyard with a fluid, practiced silence. They carried duffel bags and moved with the unnerving confidence of men who did this for a living. They weren't local thugs. They were professionals. Marcus felt a cold, familiar calm settle over him. He wasn't a homeless vet anymore. He was Master Chief Thorne, and his home was being threatened. The 2 men reached the Stingray and went to work. They didn't try the hatch. From their bags, they pulled containers of accelerant, splashing the flammable liquid around the base of the sub's hull. Their plan was brutally simple. Burn it all. Destroy the vessel, the evidence, and the man they assumed was sleeping inside. A fire in a scrapyard full of a homeless man's junk would barely raise an eyebrow. As one of the men flicked open a Zippo lighter, the small flame casting dancing shadows on his face, Marcus moved. He exploded from the darkness. a silent wraith. He closed the 10 yards between them in a heartbeat. The first man didn't even have time to register his presence before Marcus drove a hardened elbow into his temple. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. The second man spun around, startled, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol holstered on his hip. He was fast, but Ghost was faster. The dog launched himself from the shadows, a 70-pound missile of focused fury. He hit the man's gun arm, his jaws locking on with a sickening crunch of bone and tissue. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and surprise. The pistol fired, the suppressed foot barely audible over his cry. The bullet ricocheted off the steel hull with a sharp ping. Ghost yelped, a sharp cry of pain as the ricochet tore through the muscle of his left shoulder. But he did not let go. The sound of his dog's pain shattered Marcus's cold control. A primal, protective rage surged through him. He was on the second man in an instant, his hands a blur. He shattered the man's wrist, sending the pistol clattering to the muddy ground. A precise strike to the throat sent the man gasping and choking, falling to his knees. Marcus stood over them, breathing heavily, the adrenaline coursing through him. In the distance, he heard the faint wail of a siren. Silas must have heard the commotion and made the call. He knew Brody would arrive, and the official story would be a fabrication. He ignored the approaching sirens. He knelt beside Ghost, who was whimpering softly, blood matting the dark fur on his shoulder. He gently examined the wound. It was a clean through and through, painful but not life-threatening. He scooped the dog up into his arms. "I got you, boy," he whispered, his voice thick. He carried his wounded partner back to his truck, his mind racing. Peterson's words echoed in his head. The real proof is where the salt meets the sea. Pier 7. He had one move left. He started the truck and drove not away from the sirens, but toward the town, toward the old fishing pier and a dead man's final gambit. He also pulled out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to the FBI field office in Seattle, a number Eleanor had insisted he memorize. The second was to his daughter. He left a simple, raw message. "Sarah, it's Dad. I'm okay. I found something important. I'm sorry for everything." The FBI moved with a speed and efficiency that was breathtaking. Marcus met 2 grim-faced agents in a pre-dawn diner 20 miles outside of town. He handed over the waterproof case he'd retrieved from the hollowed-out piling at Pier 7. It contained everything Peterson had promised: ledgers detailing offshore accounts, micro-cassette tapes of incriminating conversations, and photographs of Kane with known assassins and cartel figures. It was the complete, undeniable architecture of a criminal empire hiding behind a veneer of patriotic service. Within 48 hours, the dam broke. Federal agents arrested Alistair Kane at a black-tie charity gala in Washington, D.C., the flash of cameras capturing his look of utter disbelief as they led him away in handcuffs. The story exploded onto the national news. Sheriff Brody was taken into custody by his own deputies, his face a mask of slack-jawed defeat as he was charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The narrative they had tried to build, of a disturbed homeless veteran, was replaced by the truth. A decorated Navy SEAL who had stumbled upon a decades-old conspiracy and refused to back down. Marcus spent days in a secure debriefing facility, going over every detail with federal investigators. They offered him witness protection, a new identity, a substantial reward from the asset forfeiture. He turned it all down. "I'm not running anymore," he told them. All he asked for was the official exoneration of Captain Elias Peterson's name. He returned to the scrapyard a week later. Ghost limped beside him, his shoulder stitched and bandaged, his tail giving a weak but steady thump against Marcus's leg. The Stingray was cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape, but it looked different to him now. It wasn't a coffin or a hideout. It was a monument to a man who had made a final, honorable stand. As he stood there watching the tide roll in, a car he didn't recognize pulled into the yard. His daughter Sarah got out. He hadn't seen her in almost a year. She looked older, her face etched with worry. She walked toward him, her eyes scanning his face, then the bandaged dog, then the submarine. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking at a broken man or a ghost from her mother's past. She was looking at her father. "I got your message," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I saw the news. Dad, are you okay?" He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The distance that had separated them for a decade felt suddenly smaller, a chasm that might, with time, be bridged. In the end, a grateful government officially awarded Marcus a finder's fee for the recovered assets. It was a staggering sum, but he knew exactly what to do with it. He found the last wish in Peterson's journal, a plan to use the money to create a place for veterans who, like him, had run out of road. He bought the scrapyard from a now-retired Silas. He established the Peterson Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing housing, job training, and counseling for veterans. The yard was cleaned up, new workshops and small cabins were built. The Stingray was cleaned, restored, and mounted on a permanent concrete cradle at the center of it all, a silent testament to its last two commanders. Marcus stood on its deck, one hand resting on the cold steel, the other on Ghost's head. He looked out at the calm waters of the Puget Sound. The place he had come to disappear had become the one place he had finally been found. The $50 he had spent on a steel tomb had bought him a future. The dog who had saved him from the rubble of one war had saved him from the wreckage of another, simply by trusting his instincts and refusing to let a good man's legacy stay buried in the dark. Subscribe for more stories of forgotten heroes and the loyalty that brings truth to light. Share this video if you believe that a person's true character is revealed when everything is on the line. And finally, tell us, what city or town are you watching from tonight? We want to hear from you in the comments below.